Ooh, I'm sorry for almost breaking that gavel. Can we close that door, please? The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to evaluate the last 4 years of the Biden administration's policy towards East Asia and the Pacific, address its successes and failures, and identify opportunities for the Trump administration to strengthen our engagement in the region. So let me now recognize myself for an opening statement. Again, welcome to East Asia and the Pacific Subcommittee's hearing entitled Missed Milestones, Evaluating the Last 4 Years in the EAP region and Unseized Opportunities under President Trump. As we convene for the first hearing of the 119th Congress, our subcommittee must reflect on the past 4 years under the Biden-Harris administration. First, we must ask the tough questions that will help us chart the course forward and ensure that we address the region's challenges head-on, including where do we go wrong on China policy? Why have we failed to enact punitive measures against the Chinese Communist Party when it was clearly warranted? Do we effectively leverage our allies and partnership to raise greater awareness regarding regional issues? Have we successfully deterred China and North Korea from advancing their dangerous agendas? Have our economic engagement goals been aligned with the demands and needs of our partners? While the Biden-Harris administration's strategy toward China has been short-sighted in many ways, one thing has remained consistent across administrations. To engage effectively in the region, we must show up and work with our allies and partners. Take, for example, the U.S. relationship with South Korea and Japan. These two nations have put aside their long-standing and unresolved historical disputes to tackle shared regional threats, including Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions and Xi Jinping's military and economic coercion. This is a perfect illustration of how collaboration, despite differences, is not only possible, but necessary. And while progress has been made, this administration has tremendous opportunity to strengthen trilateral ties. No matter the changes in domestic policies, our engagement with South Korea and Japan, as well as with Quad and ASEAN partners, must remain steadfast. The threats posed by the CCP and North Korean regime are not going away. Neither should our commitment to these vital alliances. Second, we cannot allow the global economy to yield to the CCP standards, nor can we lose the confidence of our allies and partners in American economic strength. In my travels across the East Asia and the Pacific region, the message was clear and consistent that the United States is the partner of choice. But without substantial economic incentives, our allies and friends are being forced into deeper trade dependency on China and to accept Beijing's artificially cheap investment that always comes with a price. The previous administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has the potential to provide a path forward to economically engage with these nations. Our subcommittee now has jurisdiction over the development finance corporations, and we'll use every tool at our disposal to ensure the U.S. remains an active and committed economic partner in the EAP region. Third, we must continue our work on human rights. We cannot ignore the ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, where Xi Jinping directs the imprisonment of Uyghur Muslims and Tibetans to erase their culture and identity. The CCP's transnational repression tactics have also spilled across borders. with the regime's United Front Work Department harassing and intimidating pro-democracy activists right here on the US soil. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un continues to steal from his own people, subjecting them to torture, forced labor, and conduct unlawful and extrajudicial killings. Across Southeast Asia, independent journalists and civilians face charges simply for exercising their right of free press and assembly. America is safer and more prosperous when we put US priorities first. Our allies and partners are better off when we show up for good. With that, I'm proud to have these witnesses before us today. Their insights will help us shape policies that will strengthen our position in the East Asia and the Pacific region and advance our national interests. Thank you. Let me now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Ami Bera, for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kim. Thank you, Chairwoman Kim. We've been partners in this region for quite a while. We've had a chance to travel together, and I agree with your opening statements. There's progress that's been made, but obviously there's progress that we can make going forward that really shouldn't be a partisan issue. Certainly within Congress, many of these issues are nonpartisan. We can look at the Quad Coalition. In the first Trump administration, they set some of those baselines. The Biden administration elevated to the leaders level, very early in this administration, right after the swearing in. You had a ministerial, and I think that's something that we can build on. That partnership between the United States, Japan, Australia, India is vitally important to not just the geopolitical security for the region, but also from an economic perspective, bringing India into the fold. We've had the chance to travel to Japan and Korea multiple times, and the trilateral relationship is in a much better place than it was 8 years ago. We've got to continue to keep that intact, regardless of politics in the region. Certainly the bilateral Japan-Korea relationship is in a strong place, and we've got to build off of that. And we have a responsibility as members of Congress to continue that, but also support the administration in maintaining a strong trilateral. We look at in 2019 when I traveled to the Philippines, that relationship was in a very bad place. The Philippines was headed in the direction of China. Now under the Marcos administration, getting the enhanced defense cooperation agreement in place, I think there's a real opportunity with the Trump administration again to build on that. The Philippines are right back in our fold to have regular rotations and perhaps return to permanent basing and so forth there. I think that's a nonpartisan issue. That's something we can work on. I'm just returning from Australia and New Zealand in the region, and AUKUS Pillar 1 is going very well. I've looked at the words of Secretary Hegstath and others. I think there's a strong foundation and support for AUKUS. Let's get Pillar 2 going. And again, this is a good deal for the United States. It not only establishes a presence, works with one of our Five Eyes allies. The fact that Beijing is upset about AUKUS means we're probably doing the right thing. So let's keep doing it. Let's build off of that. And again, this will allow us to maintain naval superiority in the region at a time when we're watching very provocative actions around Northern Australia, between Australia and New Zealand from the Chinese. We've got to send a strong message that is not okay in the 21st century, because that is how accidents happen. That is how wars get started. And again, the behavior that we see around there, or what we see in the South China Sea, and I know you've had a chance to see firsthand some of what's happening around in the Philippines. Again, we as the United States with our allies have to send a strong message that that's not okay. Now, if it had been up to me, we would have passed TPP a long time ago. Obviously, we find ourselves in a very different place. One area where I didn't see as much progress with the Biden administration was around trade, even digital trade. And we have agreements that we can build off of. I think it is important for us to set the contours of what trade looks like. I don't think it's going to be joining CPTPP, but can we do digital trade? Can we get some progress here, even in a bilateral way. I think that would be important. And again, I think we as members of Congress on this subcommittee can work in that area. One area that we were a little bit late to the game, but we did see the Biden administration reestablish embassies in the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu. We saw important aid and development programs going there, and it's important for us to continue to support those investments that are not big dollar items, but when you talk about the people, we are the partners of choice, the United States, but we have to be there. We have to show up, because if we're not, the PRC can show up with bags of cash and demonstrate influence in ways that we don't do business. So working with our allies in Australia, New Zealand, the Japanese are showing an increased interest in the region. Those are all things that are nonpartisan. Those are all things that I hope to be able to work with the Trump administration on, and certainly with you, Madam Chairwoman, that I think we can work on legislation that keeps moving those relationships forward. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And I love the tone of bipartisanship, especially when it comes to EAP, Pacific Island region. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for us to show up and engage with our AP region. So thank you for that. I can look forward to continuing to work with you on this committee and beyond. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And we're pleased to have distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. So let me introduce our distinguished panel. Mr. Zack Cooper, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Craig Singleton, China Program Senior Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Richard Fontaine, the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for New American Security. The chair recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have you speak with us, and look forward to hearing your testimonies and answering our questions. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your remarks or spoken remarks to 5 minutes or under in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Cooper for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be here today, and I especially appreciate the bipartisan nature of your leadership on Asia issues. Despite changes in rhetoric, recent U.S. strategy in Asia has been remarkably consistent across administrations from both parties. In short, the United States has made progress with those countries that are most concerned about Chinese behavior. I would focus here on Japan, the Philippines, India, Australia, and South Korea, the same countries that both of you mentioned in your opening remarks. But we have struggled elsewhere in the region, particularly with countries across most of Southeast Asia. And they've been disappointed by uneven U.S. engagement and inconsistent economic visions. These structural constraints, I think, are likely to continue over the next few years. And in my written testimony, I assessed the lasting impact of 5 different Biden administration initiatives on Asia. The first was continued cooperation with the Quad, the second, AUKUS security partnership, the third was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the fourth was deepening of the alliance with the Philippines, and last, US-Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation. And I think we can say that the Biden administration made real progress in many of these areas, but that we do have to rethink our approach to the region because much of the rest of the region is untouched by the efforts that we've made over the last decade or so. And so with these lessons in mind, I want to propose what I think are potentially 5 big ideas that the Trump administration and the Congress could take up over the next few years. So the first is a establishment of an allied defense arsenal effort, a major new defense industry partnership with allies taking the lead on military co-development and co-production of precision munitions and autonomous systems. The second I talk about in my written testimony is creation of an allied energy initiative to boost U.S. energy production and exports to allies in Asia who are desperate for more reliable sources of oil and natural gas. The third is formation of what I would call a Taiwan contact group, alongside U.S. allies to provide Taiwan with the capabilities needed to bolster its military defenses and societal resilience in advance of a conflict. The fourth proposal is a trade deal with the Philippines to maintain our recent alliance momentum and avoid China being able to use its economic influence with Manila to undermine an absolutely critical strategic relationship for the United States. And the fifth proposal I would put on the table is that the Trump administration should make a big bet on Indonesia, akin to its efforts with India. The reason is that Indonesia, as many of you know well, is a rising giant. It could act as a counterweight in Southeast Asia against China's regional influence, and I think it warrants much more attention from American policymakers. So those are 5 opportunities I think the Trump administration has. I want to quickly speak about 5 risks that I think are serious as well. First, Washington will need to avoid ceding a sphere of influence to China by better coordinating with its allies and partners while finding ways to stay engaged on the principles and the priorities that matter to countries in Asia. Second, threats to withdrawal support from Taiwan could further undermine the support of the Taiwanese public and their confidence in the United States. And that is particularly true, in my view, if it's coupled with a U.S. drawdown from parts of Europe. Third, the danger of South Korean nuclear proliferation is real, and I think it is growing. It is accelerated by concerns about the risk of U.S.-South Korea alliance decoupling, and that will require new engagement from policymakers here in Washington. Fourth, as you know, AUKUS remains a bold and important idea, but I think we should be assessing the role that large undersea unmanned vehicles can play in bridging some of the capability gaps that are arising as we think about AUKUS over the next couple of decades. Fifth, American policymakers will have to reconsider their approach to Southeast Asia, particularly on trade and development, lest China continue to make significant progress across the region. So in conclusion, the United States remains vital to security and prosperity across the Indo-Pacific. I thank this committee for its remarkable bipartisan leadership on these issues over many years, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Let me now recognize Mr. Singleton for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, and members of the distinguished subcommittee. Thanks for inviting me today. I'm pleased to offer policy insights from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan research institute where I serve as a senior fellow. Over the last 4 years, the Biden administration sought to stabilize relations with Beijing through sustained diplomatic dialogue and relatively restrained responses to myriad Chinese provocations. On paper, this approach aimed to avoid a bilateral breakdown. In practice, however, it did amount to diplomacy without much deterrence, emboldening Chinese Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping to test our resolve at nearly every turn. Indeed, rather than reducing tensions, these well-intentioned diplomatic overtures paradoxically fueled Xi's worst impulses, enabling Beijing to expand its surveillance, ramp up its maritime assertiveness, and deepen its ties to other authoritarian regimes at next to no cost. During Biden's tenure, Chinese spy balloons entered U.S. airspace with little consequence, while hacking campaigns, Salt, Volt, and Flax Typhoon, targeted senior American officials and sensitive networks with barely a public rebuke. Even as Beijing dramatically intensified its incursions around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, Washington's focus remained on rapid de-escalation. If left unchecked, this dynamic risks encouraging Chinese overreach, raising the specter of miscalculation or worse, war. Today's predicament evokes lessons from the late stages of the Cold War, when Washington's misguided embrace of so-called peaceful coexistence inadvertently prolonged the Soviet system's survival, treating it as an immutable juggernaut rather than one vulnerable to sustained external and internal pressure. By minimizing accountability for Chinese espionage, coercion, and violations of international norms, we risk reinforcing Beijing's conviction that its revanchist ambitions need not be curbed. A new Trump administration and the 119th Congress can move beyond mere coexistence with China, if for no other reason that the US and China embody fundamentally incompatible systems and ideologies. Simply put, today's contest cannot end in stalemate. The United States must ensure its model prevails. Moving beyond mere coexistence, a bold yet realistic aim, does not require an explicit bid for regime change. Rather, Washington should push Beijing onto an unsustainable path where credible deterrence, targeted economic pressure, and principled diplomacy expose the structural flaws of Xi's Marxist-Leninist framework. By holding out the prospect of genuine concessions on issues like trade, we can force Beijing to confront the spiraling costs of continued hostility, potentially hastening the CCP's own unraveling if it refuses to alter course. Ultimately, time is on our side if we choose to make it so. Chief among the measures Congress should consider are robust outbound investment screening and bans, accompanied with enhanced export controls and targeted sanctions to deny Xi access to both U.S. capital markets and critical technologies for military-civil fusion. Credible, proactive threats of punitive action if China crosses red lines over Taiwan or in the South China Sea reinforce that brinksmanship will be met with real enforcement. Meanwhile, Washington must support beleaguered democracies on the front lines of Chinese coercion. HFAC can champion streamlined foreign military sales and leverage presidential drawdown authorities for Taiwan, ensuring swift delivery of defensive systems and asymmetric capabilities without bureaucratic delay. A leaner, meaner, more focused foreign assistance regime centered around strategic infrastructure, digital governance, and anti-corruption programming would also deny China a foothold in critical ports, curb risky 5G networks, and strengthen partners' resilience to Chinese coercion. By demonstrating that America remains both principled and reliable, we fill aid gaps that Beijing might otherwise exploit. Finally, by insisting that allies, including Taiwan, invest more in their own security, the U.S. can spread the financial load while preserving its leadership role. This flexible transactional approach aligns with the President's America First ethos. It rewards partners who step up while denying Beijing easy wins. Rather than striving for a fragile equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, Washington must create an overwhelming deterrent that renders any attempt at forcible reunification or broader regional domination prohibitively costly. No such deterrent exists today. By shifting from passive coexistence to purposeful competition on America's terms, we can challenge the illusion of stability that has emboldened Beijing. This decisive posture, rooted in assertive reprisal rather than reflexive de-escalation, may pave the way for a new era of enduring leadership in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
Recognize Mr. Fontaine for your opening statement.
Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Barra, distinguished members of the subcommittee and staff, thank you for having me here today. From the outset, the previous administration identified China as its top priority and the Indo-Pacific as the region most deserving of its greatest attention. It had a number of notable successes, but it also left key opportunities unseized. And so the Trump administration, along with Congress, can and should build on the foundation laid over the past 4 years. In the diplomatic sphere, the Biden administration elevated the Quad to the leaders level and coordinated an ambitious effort to supply COVID-19 vaccines to Southeast Asia. It demonstrated greater American engagement with the Pacific Islands, including a summit with leaders in Washington, new diplomatic outposts, as Representative Barra said, renewing the compacts of free association. President Biden hosted the ASEAN leaders at the White House as well, stepped up high-level diplomacy with what is perhaps the Indo-Pacific's most contested region. All these were positive diplomatic steps. The administration also made significant moves on military posture, including winning base access for U.S. troops in the Philippines, securing an access arrangement with Papua New Guinea. Of course, it formed AUKUS, the Defense Technology Sharing Agreement with Australia and the UK, revised U.S. force posture in Japan, agreed on defense industrial base cooperation with India. Again, all positive signs. But for all that, the net deployment of U.S. military resources in Asia has been essentially flat for over a decade, even as China has made increases in virtually every area. And so righting the military balance in the Western Pacific and ensuring deterrence remain key challenges for the new administration. The Biden administration also refocused some of its economic efforts on the Indo-Pacific, but away from trade agreements and toward defensive measures like export controls on semiconductors, outbound investment reviews, restricting Chinese electric vehicles, and so forth. Its one attempt at an affirmative trade policy was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement, IPEF, which the chairwoman mentioned. But this was a set of agreements that rather conspicuously lacked any market access in the United States and didn't need to be approved by Congress. And so it was very limited in what it could actually put on the table in terms of what countries in the region are looking for most from the U.S. and the U.S. economy. This recent paucity of positive economic moves in Asia represents another opportunity should the administration choose to seize it. So the Biden administration's made some significant strides in the Indo-Pacific over the past 4 years, even while, of course, it was dealing with acute crises in Europe and in the Middle East. But given China's increasing military strength, its diplomatic ambition, its technological advances, there remains a long way to go. The Trump administration and Congress should pursue several opportunities. First, they should elevate regional diplomacy. The Trump administration's first meeting with the Quad foreign ministers took place on only, I believe, their second day in office. This was a good step, and it's already been followed with extensive diplomacy with regional leaders. But there are questions, of course, that are swirling about the president's regional priorities, enthusiasm for tariffs, pursuit of positive ties with Russia, and more. So high-level and sustained Indo-Pacific diplomacy will be at a premium in all of the formats available, including the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilat, the trilat with Japan and the Philippines, the Quad, and of course Congress has an important role to play here with the CODELs and the visits, both to Washington and other places. The new administration also should pursue a positive economic vision. I think there's wide agreement that the United States should continue to reduce its economic dependence on China in areas that incur national security risk. There's less agreement, but I think there should be, on the corresponding lesson here, which is you trade less with China in sensitive areas and you trade more with your friends and allies. And there are the possibility of sectoral agreements like digital trade or on critical minerals that would set rules, reduce dependencies on China, and signal renewed U.S. economic leadership. The United States on the military side can't arrest the eroding balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and meet our critical commitments elsewhere without a major increase in defense spending, and at the same time moving some of our military resources from the Middle East and Europe to Asia, especially in light of the prospects for peace in 2025 in each of those two regions. And then finally, it would be wise to avoid some unforced errors. The new administration obviously is moving quickly to differentiate itself from its predecessor, including on Asia policy, but shouldn't shoot itself in the foot by eliminating programs that have helped the U.S. bolster friends in the Indo-Pacific and contest Chinese influence, whether that's foreign aid or some of the other arrangements that are currently under question. So by avoiding own goals, by pursuing the many opportunities before it, the new administration and the U.S. Congress have a significant potential to bolster America's position in the world's most important region. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful testimonies. Your opening statements give us a lot of food for thought, and much of which we agree on. We all talked about how it is important for U.S. to show up to the region, to build that stronger relationship with our allies and partners. And also, some of you also mentioned our ability to keep up with our defense capabilities. So I want to start my questioning on that note. Allies like Korea and Japan, they have taken steps to assist the U.S. defense industrial base, and Korea's Hanwha Systems is acquiring Philly shipyards to bring shipbuilding experience to America. And Japan has already committed $1 trillion, I wish it was more, in investment to assist the U.S. with emerging technologies. And our partners are also looking to co-produce and co-develop with the United States. So we need to ensure that these collaborations align with our security interests and industrial capacity without compromising our American innovation or competitiveness. So the first question, I think I want to, Mr. Singleton is not listening, so let me wake you up. What steps can the Trump administration take to strengthen our defense industrial base while also working with our allies and partners on national security priorities and technological and economic advancements? Sorry
Thank you.
to put you on this.
Wide awake. It's amazing that we are talking about enhancements to our defense industrial base today, because we're actually thinking about investments that are going to be really coming into play tomorrow. Time is the enemy here. I think I think this administration has real opportunities when we're thinking about incentivization and also deregulation. But where we are seeing gaps quite clearly are expanding mineral stockpiles that we will need for tomorrow to actually feed and drive these industries. We actually don't have a skilled talent workforce yet for these critical industries in the defense sector. So starting to think about actual concrete programs that we can put into place through legislation to build up our tech talent workforce will be absolutely vital. I think, and Zack hit on this as well, trusted defense supply chains is probably the future, and I think East Asia will play an anchor role in that structure. Co-development with India, for example, on fighter jets, Japan, the glide phase interceptor to go after hypersonic missiles. These are all new and amazing opportunities that I don't think we would have been talking about a few years ago. Ultimately, a lot of that will be advanced through memorandums of oral commitment, memorandums of understanding, and just simple, clear-eyed engagement throughout the region. And so I think there's no shortage of opportunity here as we think about these defense supply chains. And it was actually Secretary Austin, I think, who really laid the groundwork for this last summer. And this is an area where this administration can really proceed.
Thank you, thank you. On the economic engagement, Mr. Cooper, our ASEAN partners continue to request market access, and we talked about that. IPAF is good, it's a good starting point, but as you noted, we don't have market access there. So market access to the United States is what our ASEAN partners are asking, but trade appetite in Washington is severely limited. So in your testimony, you mentioned that Trump administration is unlikely to embrace IPAF. So what alternative strategies can the administration pursue to maintain the U.S. economic influence in the region without ceding grounds to Beijing?
Thanks, Chairwoman Kim. I think the only answer then for the Trump team is to think about bilateral arrangements, since that's very clearly their preference, that are strategic in nature and absolutely critical to the United States. And so that's why, for me, focusing on the Philippines initially is probably the most critical factor. You know that, of course, we've got this Luzon economic corridor, which we are trying to do with Manila. And if that doesn't go forward, it will call into question our ability to use Philippine bases and other facilities in the event of a crisis or conflict. And so I think we're going to have to connect our economic interests with our strategic interests to make that logical chain clear for both this administration and, of course, for the Congress as well.
Thank you. Mr. Fontaine, do you want to chime in on that? Since IPAF does not provide market access, how can we incentivize more American companies, private sector engagements in the region? You know, we talked about that a little bit, but chime in.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that in the first Trump administration, the administration did reach a digital trade deal with Japan and used the digital trade chapter from USMCA there, and also had kind of a mini deal on agriculture. So it is just not completely beyond the realm of imagination to think that over the next 4 years, there are bilateral deals, particularly in sectoral areas, you know, that could be reached on digital trade, which could be done bilaterally or multilaterally, which would be more about setting the rules than even market access or some market access things, again, on relatively non-controversial areas like critical minerals and things like that. I mean, more ambitiously, you know, if the U.S. gets back in the business of, you know, free trade agreements, which admittedly is a little hard to think about right now. I mean, we could have an FTA with the Philippines. We could have an FTA with Taiwan. I mean, the centerpiece of, you know, the ill-fated TPP was essentially a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement. And so, you know, if we could politically get back to those areas, the sky is kind of the limit for what would be possible on policy grounds.
Thank you very, very much. Let me now recognize Ranking Member Bera for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm always going to be the optimist. And yeah, I think we can always increase our economic ties. But in the short term, I think there are some things that we can build off of. You know, Mr. Fontaine, you touched on the importance of critical minerals and, you know, some of the rare earths that where we are overly reliant on a single source, in this case, Beijing, and we know that how they use economic coercion. We've seen a taste of it, but it could get worse if there's a real escalation in conflict. the Biden administration had put in the Mineral Security Partnership. We've engaged in conversations with our allies in Japan and Korea, and this is not an area where we're necessarily in competition because we all need these supplies. And I'd be curious, from a congressional perspective, and then working with the administration, if we can work with our allies. Obviously, the Australians want to develop this industry, maybe a little bit more expensive than China, but again, for our security concerns, it's a way of working with Australians, Malaysia, Vietnam, other areas where we strategically could go into these areas. If I think that's the right approach at this point, is going in and developing these new markets, and even going into Africa and working in some of these places and having presence.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And of course, on the critical minerals, you have both the sourcing and then the processing. And so you have to solve both of those. Otherwise, if you're dependent on China for one or the other, then you haven't solved your problem. But that said, there are a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific and around the world that both have sources and some which should be the places where processing takes place. So the U.S. should be in the business of reducing barriers to that kind of trade in critical minerals, and potentially looking to our other tools of economic policy, through the Development Finance Corporation or, some of our aid programs and things like that, in order to incentivize private sector activity in these places. So again, I think the mantra should be, yes, trade less with China in areas of national security concern and trade more with our friends and allies in those very areas.
Mr. Cooper, do you want to add?
I would just add very briefly, this is an area where I think there are some countries in Southeast Asia that have tremendous capability to help us and help themselves, and Indonesia is sort of the most obvious of those. So I think Mineral Security Partnership is the kind of thing that should be able to last through from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, because as Craig was saying, it picks up on a lot of critical items that they've been worried about for a long time, going back to the first Trump term. But I think we've got to figure out which partners we can work with in Southeast Asia or elsewhere in the region. And for me, Indonesia would be the logical first partner to think about.
Right. Let me shift to the Pacific Islands. Large economic zone, big playing field, smaller populations. I know I've traveled extensively there. I know the chairwoman's traveling to the region as well. And when I look at recent elections, I was in the Solomons, was in PNG, the public seems to still want to move towards the West and so forth, but I really am concerned when it comes time to form a government, just Beijing's influence, and we don't have to get into the details of it, but things that we're not going to do. It's not how we do business, but you talked about corruption, Mr. Cooper. When it comes time to form governments, the governments are not necessarily moving in our direction. And I think we've got to come up with some tools on how to counter that influence. And if you want to talk about that, Mr. Cooper, and then if the others want to add something.
Yeah, Ranking Member, just a brief remark, which is, I think we've had a number of wake-up calls, and every time we say it's a wake-up call and then we don't really wake up. First with Solomon Islands, then we were worried about Vanuatu, now it's Cook Islands, and every time we say we've woken up, and then every time there's another Pacific island that does a deal with China that we didn't see coming. I think the Trump team should get a lot of credit for, in the first term, putting a lot of effort into the Pacific Islands, right? I think we have to make sure that they maintain that focus now. There are a lot of distractions around the world, and the Pacific isn't the easiest place to maintain focus, and we haven't done that consistently over years. So I think we've got to use the Cook Island situation now as another wake-up call to focus our minds.
Having just been in Auckland last week, obviously that's of concern. I think how we may approach it as Congress is working with Australia, New Zealand, and Japan's showing increased. Like, how do we share the burden? How do we, even the French, pulling the French in as well. Mr. Fontaine, if in the last few.
Well, you just made the point that I was going to make, which is that we've got friends in this enterprise. So we're not going to do what the Chinese do and engage in bribery and state capture and things like that. We're going to have a different model and a different approach to engagement, but it has to be sustained. and it has to be a long-term effort. And ultimately, it's we don't want to see China get a foothold, certainly in security terms, in these areas, which would constrain our own freedom of action and that of our friends and allies. So if you start from that point and then look, what are the tools that we have available to be able to influence and frankly to help these countries with their own sovereignty, so that they're not ultimately undermined by Chinese activity, that is something that should appeal to these governments over time, and in that we can enlist friends like New Zealand and Australia.
Thank you. Let me now go to the members' questioning session, and I'd like to first call upon Representative Moreland to ask your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kim. And I want to express my disapproval of President Biden's absence in the East Asia Summit during his tenure. The U.S. relationship with the Association of Southeast Asian Nation members is critical for the economic, political, and the defense of prosperity in the region. The President's participation in these diplomatic channels is essential to ensuring that the U.S. presence in Asia remains constructive, visible, and lasting. Partnerships such as the AUKUS Alliance or the Quad organization have greatly enhanced the overall security of the Indo-Pacific. Now, despite their significance, the United States' overemphasis on defensive measures has alienated potential allies and support. The East Asia Summit and other ASEAN-sponsored discussions are opportunities for the U.S. to cooperate on issues like healthcare and trade and disaster response and even energy. Yet, the non-participation or just vocalizing the anti-Chinese sentiment is a missed opportunity that the United States cannot afford. Unlike the previous administration, President Trump must approach the organization like ASEAN with the same passion as defense partnerships. And some have even cited President Xi Jinping and President Putin as examples of the absence to defend President Biden's non-attendance. But the United States can and must do better. For diplomatic efforts, we must stop looking at PRC or Russia as an example and demonstrate that the United States will be a lasting ally. In the absence of our adversaries, the United States can assert itself as a preferred partner in the Pacific. The United States has recently accomplished significant diplomatic achievements in the Indo-Pacific, such as the U.S. Alliance for International Development's disaster teams or professional development programs in Cambodia. Nevertheless, the United States cannot rest on its diplomatic laurels, and these relationships need demonstration of our commitment. So I implore the Trump administration to learn from President Biden's mistakes. And I ask you, Mr. Singleton, you have vast experience and appreciate that. And what actions can the U.S. take to strengthen trust and cooperation with ASEAN nations, particularly those growing closer to China?
No, thank you, sir. I mean, I think we mentioned it earlier, but we have to show up. I think our greatest comparative advantage would be presence, persistence, and partnership. And the region isn't opaque. They make clear to us directly what they want from us. And I think there are transactional opportunities that benefit both sides. I think talk of market access, talk of economic engagement is the missing link today. And most countries in the region are deeply concerned about their reliance on China for key critical supply chains. They're concerned about Chinese companies relocating into their markets. And those dependencies and the weaponized interdependence that comes with them is concerning. I think the biggest signal that the president can make, though, is by simply having consistent outreach to countries in the region, hosting them here, deepening people-to-people ties, showing up. Chinese leader Xi Jinping does it quite well. The Chinese operate a vast diplomatic presence across the region. I think we have real opportunity here to actually show up on the ground and demonstrate what we're willing to bring to the table.
Thank you. And briefly, Mr. Fontaine, you spoke about the coordination the Biden administration accomplished with Pacific Island countries. In what areas should the Trump administration build off these initial success?
There's several. Well, one is to, of course, sustain the diplomatic engagement by having established the embassies in Solomons and Vanuatu and Tonga, and the China Solomons security agreement was, as my colleague said, a big wake-up call, but then we get additional wake-up calls after additional wake-up calls, and so to sustain the diplomatic engagement there is one aspect of all this. I come back just on trade. I mean, these are very small economies and all of this, but one of the great advantages the United States has is the big economic market, and to provide access to that economic market, particularly for countries who, it's going to be almost a rounding error in terms of their economic relationship with us, is another big advantage. And then, again, working with these countries in combination together with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other bigger countries, including from a little bit further outside, in order to demonstrate a vision which is not the U.S. would like to dominate the region instead of China, but rather this is about your own independence and sovereignty and ability to make your own sovereign decisions, that we want to support that as opposed to what China has on offer.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Let me now recognize Representative Sherman for your 5 minutes of questioning.
China's been on the rise ever since, at the beginning of this century, we gave them permanent most favored nation status. I was there at the time, and they told us it would increase the trade deficit by $1 billion. They were off by 4,000%. I would point out that the vast majority of Democrats voted against that action, and we did so under pressure from a Democratic president who turned out to be wrong on this one issue. And I would hope our Republican colleagues will take note of this. Perhaps your proudest hour will be an occasion where you say no to a Republican president. We now have this enormous trade deficit with China. I would point out that it is considerably larger under Trump 1.0 than it was under Biden. And that was particularly true in the pre-COVID years of the Trump administration. So while Trump talks about how other countries are eating our lunch, they ate our lunch and our dinner under the first Trump administration. Now, one issue we have is Americans investing in Chinese stocks. Now, China wants to encourage its people to invest in their stock, and they provide tax incentives for doing so. But they're careful to make sure that no citizen of China gets an incentive, a tax credit, for investing in American stocks. But we have a capital gains allowance where we provide many hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to benefit Americans who invest in Chinese stocks. If any of you think that that's a good idea, could you raise your hand? I'm not seeing. But what's surprising is I only got one Republican co-sponsor for my bill to take away this subsidy for investing in the Chinese economy. And I would hope that we would do a lot better in this Congress. You'll have to stand up to billionaires to do that, because billionaires think they should get a tax incentive for everything, even being Benedict Arnold when it comes to where they invest their money. I think you pointed out how some of the small countries in the Pacific are rounding errors when it comes to trade. It's even more of a rounding error when it comes to aid. I believe that the special, the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party unanimously and in a bipartisan way called on us to fully fund USAID. Now, American soldiers, including my father's friends, died in the Pacific over the very islands that would be of great strategic importance if, God forbid, we ever ended up in another war with a major Asian power. Raise your hand if you think it made any sense for us to stop all aid to the small islands in the Pacific as we did just a week or two ago when we froze all USAID. Again, I'll say that no hands went up. The Solomon Islands, where so many Americans, Marines, died, we had a $21 million economic support arrangement with, and we've stopped that. And even if we started again, we've proven ourselves to be unreliable. A $95,000 aid program to the Cook Islands, and we stopped that. It's tragic. Now I'll point out one other thing. We've got China making these debt trap loans where they loan money and there's no way that the project will pay it back. Should we encourage nations that are a victim of this to simply not pay China back? Does anybody agree with that or disagree? Should Sri Lanka be writing well, so I'll point out that we in effect force these countries to pay back because we allow our credit rating agencies and our lenders to treat a country as if it's a bad credit risk because they fail to pay China back. I would say that we ought to turn to countries and say, don't give China your port, give them your middle finger. And then you'll still be able to borrow from Europe, from the United States, and from the international community. And with that, my time has expired.
I recognize Representative Barr for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Singleton. Thank you for recognizing the COINS Act, the outbound screening legislation from the last Congress that I worked on. And I do agree with you that we do need legislation to address capital flows into China, especially to Chinese entities of national security concern and technologies that threaten our national security as well. Last Friday, President Trump issued an executive order titled American First Investment Policy and issued a national security memorandum that was in large measure aligned with the principles of the COINS Act. He said in conjunction with that release, we will adopt new rules to stop U.S. companies from pouring investments into China and stop China from buying up America, allowing all of these investments that serve American interests, meaning that it's exactly the right policy. It's the America First policy. Red light to investments that compromise our national security, but allow those investments that actually advance our interests. My question to you is, given the fact that the administration has now issued an executive order, it replaces the Biden executive order on outbound investment screening, is it important that Congress act as well here? Is it important that Congress pass legislation to provide statutory definition to all of this?
No, absolutely. And thank you for your leadership on this issue. I mean, cutting off Xi's access, I would say, to Western capital and technology is like depriving a fire of oxygen. I think if we don't, we're sort of very much fueling the system that is seeking to overshadow our own. I was very impressed with the policy release memo last week, but it's vital that those protections be codified into law. In many respects, the memo released last week goes a little bit farther than COINS by identifying new sectors, including biotechnology, which I would argue is the next semiconductors, where we need to be hyper vigilant about capital flows. But I think what's captured in the COINS Act is exactly the right pitch perfect moment. There's bipartisan consensus. I know it was a long road to get there, but I think at this point, it's the best hope for right now.
Yeah, and thanks, Mr. Singleton, for recognizing that the Treasury White House release is slightly different than COINS, and we've actually been reaching out to the administration asking for interagency technical assistance. We want to incorporate that into the release of COINS 2.0. What would you say, though, to the argument that, and obviously because of my work on this, I support the effort, but what would you say to those who make the argument, and it's not altogether a bad point, that under Xi Jinping, China has abandoned the American innovation model, that the Chinese Communist central planning has replaced private allocation of capital with state-run investment, and because of that, between 2018 and 2023, the number of annual startups founded in China has collapsed by over 97%. and that Chairman Xi's crackdown has really deterred U.S. investment. Since 2018, U.S. venture capital deals in China have fallen by 87%. In other words, the market is taking care of this. China's economy is collapsing. China's disadvantage is that they're communists. And so outbound investment is slowing down because it's a bad place to invest. Do we still need coins? Do we still need an investment screening tool?
No, absolutely. I mean, Xi Jinping is his own worst enemy, and his economic stewardship has led China to where it is today, which is on the point of economic collapse, quite frankly. I think what we have to do is protect American capital, American investors, and American technology, and institute through law common sense guardrails that ensure that American capital isn't flowing into the very technological sectors that are being used to fuel Chinese military modernization. And I think that linkage between the military and the civil, particularly as it relates to investment screening and bans, is essential, if for no other reason that just because China's economy is suffering today doesn't mean that they can't recover tomorrow.
Well, I agree with you, and I agree with President Trump on his executive order. Look, it's true. Chairman Xi has, in some regards, made China uninvestable. Why on earth anyone would want to invest in a communist economy where at any moment's notice, at the whim of the bureaucrats in Beijing, all of your investment could disappear. Nevertheless, there are capital flows. There are Western investors, U.S. and otherwise, who are investing in some of these critical technologies, and so we do need legislation. I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Amo for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman, and it's a pleasure to be on this subcommittee, and I look forward to your leadership and that of the ranking member over this Congress. I know that every member of our subcommittee wants to advance American interests and counter China's influence in East Asia and the Pacific. And every member should want to strengthen our supply chains, boost economic cooperation, and protect our national security. And I believe that every member understands the only way to achieve this is by building alliances and partnerships. As we look at the last 4 years, I believe that President Biden understood these points. It's why he led a historic effort to establish one of the most significant security agreements in generations. Australia, United Kingdom, United States Security Pact, as everyone knows, is AUKUS. And it's important to just break it down and share that, the AUKUS improves that monitoring and increases deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. It allows the United States to continue our leadership in emerging defense technology. Pillar 1 created a pathway for Australia to acquire nuclear submarines. Pillar 2 created deeper cooperation between all of the three allies for advanced defense capabilities. Now, many businesses in my home state of Rhode Island are working on technology included in AUKUS, like the Virginia-class submarine, or they're developing technology for Pillar 2, like the next generation of underwater drones. And so this agreement promotes national security and boosts local economies with good-paying jobs. It strengthens our relationships around the world. Mr. Fontaine, could you share why it's so essential that we continue the work of AUKUS, and how can we work to strengthen cooperation as we move further into Pillar 2?
Sure, thank you, Congressman. Well, Pillar 1, I think the case for that is probably straightforward, but to increase over some years, but nevertheless, to increase the number of allied nuclear-propelled submarines in the key military theater is a good thing, especially given China's increasing capabilities across the board. So we want that, and of course, the Australian participation in Pillar 1 of AUKUS is a significant injection of several $1 billion into the submarine industrial base in the United States at a moment when we're behind on sub-production, and so that's a good outcome as well. On Pillar 2, in a way, a lot of the hard work has already been done. The Congress, went through the exercise of ITAR reform, which is always, throwing sand in the gears of some of these ability of countries, including some of our closest intelligence and military partners, to cooperate with us in technology. So that part has been done. We've taken our lumps from the French for having, participated in the subcontract. So a lot of the hard work has been done. On Pillar 2, I think that the key is to have some quick, visible wins, because this is a proof of concept, right? This is not only something that could work for the U.S., the United States, the U.S., U.K., and Australia, but if this goes well and we can show that things are possible with Pillar 2 that otherwise wouldn't be, then Japan, South Korea, India, other countries can plug in on particular projects in a similar sort of fashion. But we haven't seen the quick wins yet, and there's a bunch of potential projects. I mean, the Australians have some unique capabilities on quantum, PNT, position, navigation, and timing. You mentioned unmanned undersea capabilities. In a matter of months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months on the back end, not years, to show some quick wins on Pillar 2 would give some serious momentum to AUKUS, and I think demonstrate its utility to everybody.
And I greatly appreciate your point of emphasis on growing partnerships. And I'm hopeful that, after the past 36 days of the Trump administration, that the administration will demonstrate that they value these partnerships, that they understand the value therein. Because, we've seen questioning our transatlantic alliances, we've seen foreign aid freezes, and we want to lower the temperature and ensure that our friends around the world aren't going to question our commitment to our values. And jeopardizing those would be a problem too, proceeding as we should in AUKUS. And so, it is my hope that we don't have an absence of American leadership, because if that is the case, China will take advantage to fill that vacuum, reaching out to our allies and partners, being more of a threat in the Indo-Pacific, and doing the work to really combat our values, our sense of our leadership in the world. And that's a message that I think we can all agree on. With that, I yield.
Thank you very much. Let me recognize Representative Wagon for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Talofa lava, and good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Kim and Ranking Member Bera, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the panel for testifying today. As you may be able to tell how I'm dressed, I am a Pacific Islander and represent the beautiful territory of American Samoa, the only United States soil south of the equator. So this hearing is especially important to me as we are discussing my home, the Pacific. I want to highlight some recent developments in the Pacific Islands. Within the past 3 weeks, both independent Samoa and the Cook Islands have signed major agreements with China. Unfortunately, I don't have a map here, but independent Samoa is my neighbor, 60 miles to the west. Cook Islands are my neighbor to the east, along with Kiribati. My home district is now surrounded on 3 sides by countries that have signed major economic and security deals with China. And since this hearing is on opportunities for the new administration, what are actions that President Trump and Secretary Rubio can do to counteract China in the Pacific Islands? And I'd like all 3 of you to answer, please.
Well, we talked earlier about potential trade opportunities and things like that, and there's also the aid aspect of this. As we were discussing before, the amounts of aid are relatively small that go into these countries when you look in the grand scheme of the amount of foreign aid that the United States has provided to countries all over the world. But it makes a big difference there, and we frankly are in a competition with China for influence. I think what we don't want to see is exactly what you described, where we have sovereign U.S. soil surrounded on 3 sides by countries that wish to be closer to China economically and certainly security-wise. So to use the various tools in our toolkit on aid, on trade, on diplomatic engagement, on security support and things like that, those are the things that can make a difference. But again, it has to be sustained. We have to demonstrate that this is not just a kind of epiphenomenon where we are suddenly interested in the Pacific Islands and we develop some initiatives and then they start to fade in a couple of years. We have to sustain these efforts over a long period of time.
Congresswoman, I would just add briefly, I think it's absolutely critical that the United States explain not just to policymakers, but also to the American people why this is in the American interest. And those of us in the think tank community probably have our work cut out on that issue. But I think it's actually pretty clear. If you're President Trump and you're looking for areas where a little bit of money goes a long way, what better place than the Pacific? Relatively small populations that are desperate for greater engagement from the United States. Sometimes they're not even looking for a lot of money, right? Sometimes it may just be a little bit of diplomatic engagement, right? Opening embassies in some places that's relatively cheap. And the strategic logic is extremely clear. And anyone that's read their history knows why that's the case. So I think the challenge we're going to have is that some of these ongoing programs, I think, are probably paused at the moment. And so we're going to have to explain both, to the American people, but also to some people within the government, why these are so critical and why spending a little bit of money now in these areas is absolutely important in the long term.
No, I would agree with everything that's been said, and just add on that beyond the deal with the Cook Islands, we also saw live fire drills around Australia this week. Quite alarming, demonstrating, I think, a capability and an intent from the Chinese to project much farther from their shores. I think as it relates specifically to Pacific Island countries, there are several opportunities. One is seabed mineral mining, which is an area that's ripe for, I think, opportunity for the United States. I think fishery management, maritime transport and security are other areas that closely align with this administration and the previous administration, even educational exchange, climate change assistance and support. These are all, I think, basic programs that I think, to the points raised, are relatively inexpensive, but go a long way to deepen people-to-people ties.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I recognize Representative Castro for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Fontaine, in your testimony, you note that in 2022, Nepal accepted a $500 million grant through the Millennium Challenge Corporation to expand its electricity grid and improve road infrastructure. China and their supporters in Nepal fought hard to try to prevent this. They argued that Nepal was making a mistake in working with the United States, and I'm glad that they were unsuccessful in their argument. The Trump administration has abruptly frozen this assistance with no transparency. Many government officials in Nepal now worry whether they made the right decision in partnering with the United States. How do you think Nepal's leaders feel about their decision to make the politically difficult decision to ignore China, to bypass China, and to work with the United States?
Well, I suppose they're waiting for the outcome of this review, and I hope that this gets turned back on, because this is the reason I mentioned it in my testimony. If you look at this $500 million MCC compact with Nepal, it took Kathmandu about 5 years to actually come to the point where they agreed to do it for exactly the reasons that you said, because they were being lobbied by the Chinese not to do it, because this is a kind of a declaration of strategic intent that they had to think pretty hard about. And it's also worth noting that this all took place during the first Trump administration. This was a Trump administration idea to do this with Nepal. And so now that this is frozen, the Chinese would love to march in and say, we will replace the Americans here and also point out American unreliability if we were able to say once this was going and now this is not. And it's also worth noting that Nepal agreed to kick in $200 million of its own money toward all of this. So it wasn't just us putting in our own.
Oh, thank you. And I guess, well, let me ask you, do you have confidence that that aid will be unfrozen, or that deal will be unfrozen? Bear in mind, the National Endowment for Democracy, their funding has been frozen. IRI is frozen. NDI is frozen. That represents, along with what USAID represented on the development side, a way that the United States engaged the world and also promoted democracy around the world. So I would ask the panel, having seen what you have seen of the Trump administration, the United States, for example, just voted with Russia this week to prevent a resolution that essentially would have placed the blame on Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. From what you've seen so far, do you have confidence that these funds will be unfrozen?
I don't know what's going to happen with the funds, but I can point out, in addition to the Nepal example I gave, how I think some of this, if not corrected, amounts to shooting ourselves in the foot. So if you look at what NDI and IRI has been doing, they've funded, for example, groups in Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, which have already been approached by the Chinese saying, because the funds have been frozen, saying we will replace the American funds. Now, these are democracy groups, so they don't have much interest in taking money from the Chinese in the first place, but that's not going to be the case for everybody. And so again, there's, the Chinese are sort of ready
So
to do
it's
this.
created an opportunity for China to come in as we've
Correct.
pulled back or receded.
Or, IRI, for example, provides cyber tools for circumvention technologies and other things that allow dissidents and democracy activists in places like China to be able to communicate with each other away from the watchful eye of the state. Well, that's frozen now. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we would want to have in our arsenal as we compete with China.
Gentlemen, you all have, and I would just also note real quick that I think what's especially troubling is while these funds are frozen, these deals are frozen, it's not as if there's been some other plan that's been laid out to describe, what else is going to go on in lieu of these things, right? Like, then you could have some debate about whether that's better. Here, everything's just frozen.
Well, I think it was, Secretary Mattis that said that if we don't end up spending a little bit of development assistance in places, then we end up having to use bullets, and that certainly, I think, would be the concern. I'll just say very briefly that I think at the end of the day, the Trump administration, I understand the logic of why they want to cut down on government spending, right? But I think the point that's critical is we've got to do an assessment of each of these projects to see whether it's worthwhile. And so doing anything across the board doesn't make sense, especially when we can't turn them back on after that. And so I worry a huge amount about the damage that could do over the long term.
I would add, China routinely criticized IRI, NDI, and NED projects, and I think they claimed that we were smearing Beijing. I think that is reason enough to keep a lot of them. But I think a wholesale review is important. That should be done expeditiously, and I think to the extent possible, a lot of these projects should be reinstated. So.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Biggs for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I appreciate our witnesses today for your testimonies this afternoon. As the engine of the global economy, East Asia and Pacific, and I'll just say EAP here on out, the Pacific's stability is fundamentally linked to our prosperity and security. Maritime domain awareness is therefore paramount within this vast space, demanding a comprehensive approach that recognizes the interconnectedness of security and economic environment. So serving on both this subcommittee and the Homeland Security, Transportation, and Maritime Security Subcommittee grants me a unique dual perspective. From my vantage point, the United States Coast Guard's leadership in enhancing the region's maritime domain awareness is undeniable. We see the Coast Guard standing shoulder to shoulder with nations across the EAP region, from Palau in the Pacific Islands to Japan in Northeast Asia. In Palau, this partnership focuses on countering illicit maritime activities like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which safeguard our vital resources. Further north, the Coast Guard conducts engagement with Japanese counterparts by collaborating on regular Western Pacific exercises and active intelligence sharing that strengthens interoperability and ultimately contributes to a more transparent and secure maritime environment. Across the EAP, the Coast Guard embodies this proactive approach, not simply reacting to crises, but actively fostering maritime safety and security by assisting nations in incident response, providing essential support, and building critical maritime domain awareness. This vital work takes on even greater significance as maritime domain awareness becomes a central pillar of the Quad initiative, which recognizes that a stable and secure maritime domain is foundational for regional peace and prosperity. This brings me to my first question, and I would like to ask each of you to please respond briefly. But what specific role can an increased Coast Guard presence play within the Quad framework to address the complex and evolving regional security challenges that we face today?
I'll go first. I mean, I think countering Chinese illegal fishing is one area where the Coast Guard has an important role to play as a force multiplier, but frankly as an untapped resource. And it's not limited to the EAP region. There are news reports this week of Chinese illegal fishing fleets operating off the coast of Argentina, where the Argentine military actually had to intervene. I think these are areas where the Coast Guard has tremendous experience and expertise and technology, and where we can really have value add.
Thank you.
And I would just add, ma'am, it's so critical in many of these countries that they don't have the ability to easily cooperate with our Navy. Our naval ships tend to be much larger and much more capable than their navies are. And much of the time, their navies are doing missions that are much more similar to our Coast Guard, with vessels that are closer in size to Coast Guard vessels. And so often they actually, I think, prefer to be able to work with our Coast Guard than sometimes the Navy, which is a little bit more challenging for them to deal with on a symmetrical basis. So I think there's tremendous interest across the region, really not just in the Pacific, but the whole region, in having a much greater U.S. Coast Guard presence.
Thank you.
I guess just violently agreeing with my colleagues. I mean, I think the appetite for greater maritime domain awareness by the countries in the region is almost unlimited. I mean, they don't have the capabilities often to understand the environment themselves, and by plugging into activities and information gathering activities that the United States does, especially through the Coast Guard, that's a major service that the United States can provide, and ultimately is good for us, because not just about fending off China, and it's about illegal fishing, but it's also piracy and humanitarian response and natural disasters and things like that. If there's an area to do more, there's been some activities through the Quad and things, but the more of the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean are particularly not well defined in terms of maritime domain awareness, and so that would be an obvious region in order to an obvious region to look for if we wanted to do more.
Thank you. My time's up.
Thank you. I recognize Representative Olszewski for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll just echo the sentiments of my colleagues earlier about how grateful I am to be serving on the subcommittee on East Asia and the Pacific. It is rewarding and gratifying to see the level of bipartisanship already being displayed, both on this side of the dais, but also some of the unanimity from our witnesses today. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us. Look forward to working with you, Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera. Thank you for leading the way in that work as well. I just want to dive in a little bit. I think the stage has sort of been set earlier. I loved, Mr. Cooper, your comment about what better place than the Pacifics to sort of make these small investments for big return, small amounts of diplomacy for big return. I really appreciate you all sharing the concern about damage over the long term. I appreciate your candor in the uncertainty as to if or when or which pieces of aid might be restored, but that are also critical. I guess just taking a slightly different look at it is, can you, one or several of you, speak briefly to the fact of, now that aid has been stopped, are we seeing, and to what degree are we seeing China step in? Do you have any specific examples or data that you can share in terms of what we're seeing now that that aid has dried up?
Well, I gave a couple before, but on Nepal, certainly the potential demise of the MCC compact with the $500 million compact with Nepal gives China an opportunity, which it has been attempting to make political and economic inroads in Nepal for a long time. And then, the other specific examples were on, the freeze in the availability of cyber tools that are provided through IRI and in particular to dissidents in places, including inside China, and able to communicate safely and securely. Those are frozen now. That would obviously give the government of China an opportunity. And in, at least my understanding is that partners of both IRI and NDI in Burma, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have been already approached by China to say, if the Americans won't fund you, we will. So those are a few specific examples.
Can I just add a broad point to build on Richard's, which is if you look at polling data across Southeast Asia, the data has not been great for the United States over the last 5 years. It showed a decreasing confidence in continued American engagement. And unfortunately, that's true from both of the last two administrations. Now, I think if you overlap that with what you're just talking about, Congressman, that it's just going to accelerate these questions about whether the United States is really a reliable partner. And unfortunately, that's happening at a time that China's already making even more inroads and building more influence in parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific and South Asia and elsewhere. So I worry that this is reinforcing trends that were already occurring in the region. And so if we're going to reverse those trends, not only do we have to turn the money back on in most cases, we're also going to have to think of new ideas and new proposals to add to that. So I think it's not just a question of stopping the damage. We also have to reverse the momentum and put some ideas on the table ourselves.
I would agree wholeheartedly. I mean, we've seen indications in places like Cambodia as well, Myanmar, about deactivation of these programs, particularly in the civil society and reporting space, journalist space. I think one thing we've all realized is that a lot of Chinese coercion is quite corrosive on civil society, and it's very important that we fund free academic journalist exchanges on the ground so they can report the situation fairly and accurately, and we're not ceding the information space to the Chinese.
So just fair to say, the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be not only to get back to where we were, but to also, fair to say, yeah. And I'll just reaffirm to my colleagues here and to others, I think many of us are committed to rooting out waste and abuses that are legitimate. So to the extent we continue this conversation, we very much want to be a part of stopping aid that does not advance American interests while not having the damage done that we're seeing today. So thank you all very much. With that, Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you. We do have some time, so I would like to take the opportunity to go for a second round of questioning. And the first question I would like to address is the CCP and its IP theft that we're all concerned about. According to FBI, the CCP steals up to $600 billion worth of U.S. intellectual property every year. So we need to use every tool available to stop this obvious theft and hold the CCP accountable. So I would like to first ask Mr. Singleton, maybe start, and then you can all chime in. How can the U.S. leverage existing partnerships that we have in the Indo-Pacific with our allies and partners so that we can create a unified or united front against the CCP's IP theft?
No, absolutely. So much of the IP theft that we discuss is occurring in the commercial space, but I also focus on the academic space as well. Congress recently reintroduced the Deterrent Act, which aims to crack down on Chinese attempts to secure intellectual property from our college campuses, much of which is funded by Congress. I think these are basic common sense measures that will force universities to reckon with the fact that they're going to have to diligently report their entanglements with Chinese universities and Chinese companies, particularly those tied to Chinese civil military fusion. I think that's probably one key area where partners and allies are on board with rigorous academic partnership screening. It's an area where other countries, including Canada, are actually ahead of us. I think we have a lot to learn, but this is an area where I think you're going to see broad agreement and recognition that we have to close those loopholes beyond the corporate IP theft that we see every day.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, I, a number of years ago, had the chance to do a report with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies on this very specific issue. And one thing that we pointed out in that report is there are a number of products in which the US government has charged Chinese agents with stealing American technology. And the businesses that were engaged in that stolen technology are still selling the products back into the United States. Solar cells, for example, at massive scale, and they drove the American producers out of business in so doing. I don't understand how we can't just turn the spigot off of the ones where we actually indicted people in China working for the government who are stealing this technology, and we're still letting them drive our companies out of business years later. So I think there are areas like that where we just absolutely have to take action. And until we do, I don't think that Beijing is going to take us seriously on this issue.
Please chime in, Mr. Fontaine.
Well, China's theft of intellectual property from the United States and other countries as well is described by some as one of the greatest wealth transfers in history, and I think probably rightly so. And when you look at it, it truly is outrageous, both in terms of scale and just the substance of what the Chinese have been doing over time with this expensive time, the amount of time that it takes to develop technology and intellectual property that have been stolen and then exploited for economic reasons, including sometimes in our own markets. The only thing that I would add in terms of potential remedies is to the degree to which the intellectual property is stolen or is resident in cyberspace and through cyberspace. I think there's a role for offensive cyber activities in all of this. I mean, this is something somewhat controversial inside the government and policymaking circles. You have to be careful about these things, but we do have a lot of insights into who some of these actors are, how they operate, and the cyber tools that they use in order to conduct this theft. And we have a lot of our own that we should be using just to protect ourselves and to exact a price on those who have engaged in these transgressions.
Thank you. I would like to talk about one other issue, which is North Korea policy. We need to make some adjustments, and the U.S. need to make some policy changes toward North Korea, considering the evolving nuclear ambitions and continued weapons development. And I would like to see how you can, talk to us about the U.S. taking leverage on existing minilateral frameworks to strengthen the extended deterrence and enhance our regional security. Do you want to go, Mr. Cooper?
Sure. I think this is an incredibly important issue. And, unfortunately, I think our approach in recent years is probably best termed strategic patience 2.0. We've just sort of waited and put our attention into other things. And the reality is that the problem has gotten worse. And so bad, in fact, that I think the risk is that now our allies in South Korea are actually fairly serious about developing their own independent nuclear capabilities because they worry about the pathway that North Korea is on. So I don't know whether Donald Trump can engage with Kim Jong-un directly and address some of these issues, but I think we absolutely have to think about a renewed campaign to shift the direction, because otherwise we're going to end up with an even larger North Korean arsenal, even more missiles, and without a strategy to deal with it.
Thank you. Ranking member?
Sure, I'll just make a few closing comments, and should have said this off the top. Appreciate the bipartisan nature of this, but to our Foreign Service officers, folks that are working overseas, I visit with them. They're often working in tough places and refugee camps, et cetera. These are patriotic Americans, and I feel for what they're going through right now, the uncertainty. Having just traveled abroad, having had side conversations with folks, these are not folks that see the world as Democrats or Republicans. They see themselves as patriotic Americans, and I do want to publicly say thank you for your service and thank you for what you're doing, and hang in there. Again, we don't want to lose that talent, especially some of the younger folks, but also the folks that have made a 30, 35-year career out of this. These are patriotic Americans. I'm glad to hear in a bipartisan way, the importance of some of these programs, and some of these programs started in the first Trump administration. So, we had Congressman Yoho, our former colleague, here 2 weeks ago, and just kind of watched him work the BUILD Act with Senator Coons and others. The Trump administration should be proud about that. They should not take that apart. As we come up on reauthorizing the DFC, these are tools that I'd actually like to see us expand. They're tools that are good for America. They're good for American businesses. They're good for our influence. In February of 2020, right before the pandemic shut things down, led a CODEL to Sri Lanka and Nepal, largely because both of them had MCC compacts that were sitting on the table that we absolutely saw Chinese misinformation. Like, these are grants. These are not Belt and Road type of debt diplomacy. These were direct grants. Now, the Rajapaksa administration ultimately turned that down. And we did see the debt trap that Sri Lanka ended up in and what it did to its economy. It did take a lot of work to get Nepal and Kathmandu to agree. It was a good deal. It is still a good deal for them. To the Nepalese, hang in there. We will do everything we can to get those dollars flowing. Do not take the, again, look eyes wide open with how the Chinese do aid and development and use debt traps. And you can look around the world and see the downside and the danger of that. That said, I do think with this America First initiative, we are going to have to rethink a little bit how we do aid, development, and finance. And I touched on in my earlier comments how we leverage our resources with our like-minded, like-valued allies that have interest in this region. And again, I think that is where we, with the European Union, with Japan, Korea, Australia, even India that has an older relationship with Africa and broad diasporas there, we ought to be looking for places where we can work and leverage our resources to go further to develop these economies and go into places like Kenya to develop things. We also should look at programs, when I've traveled around the Pacific Islands, there's a really elegant program called the Pacific Island Tuna Program that the Nature Conservancy with Walmart using DFC funds and so forth. Like, these are great programs that, are public-private partnerships and, help build the resilience of fisheries and do development projects in some of these Pacific Islands. I would urge us as a subcommittee to look at how we can support and broaden some of these programs like Pacific Island Tuna. It's not unique to Walmart, and we've had those conversations, but again, it's a really elegant program that is really appreciated in the Marshall Islands, and a place like PNG would be the perfect place for us to go and expand a program like that. So I look forward to working with the witnesses in your organizations. I think it's an incredibly important time. Government efficiency is fine. Looking at programs and how we bring these programs to the 21st century is fine. But as we come out of this initial period of disruption, I think it behooves all of us as Democrats, Republicans, academics, and the think tank community to say, okay, what would the right aid and development programs for the 21st century be like? What would the right strategy be? How do we partner with our allies and others to create that 21st century that we really want to see? So it'll be different than the past, but what's that future, geopolitical strategy for the 21st century look like? So thank you again for being here, and again, thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Yes, thank you, Ranking Member. As we close, I'd like to, just echo how important the East Asia and the Pacific region is for the United States and its role on the world stage. As we reflect on the last 4 years, and I think we've done that very constructively and productively through our engagements and our dialogue today. So I want to thank you again for your insights. And moving forward, I think it is very, very essential that we focus on strengthening our alliances and partnerships throughout the region. And collectively, we can combat the shared threats from North Korea, China. And these are the threats that we face today, and it's not going away anytime soon. So our engagement must remain steadfast, regardless of domestic political changes. And we must also ensure that our economic strategy aligns with the needs of our partners. Right? It's not something that is one-sided, so we need to really, really find ways to work together with our partners and allies. And we must offer alternatives to China's state-driven economic model that too many countries have been forced to accept. So we need to show up. We need to bring alternative solutions to them. And we cannot allow the global economy to be dictated by Beijing standards. So while we stay resilient and steadfast, again, we need to be mindful of what our allies and partners' needs are. Washington must use every available tool to advance our economic agenda while punishing the CCP's unfair trade practices. Finally, we talked about human rights in my opening remarks, and I don't think we went into that in depth today in our conversation, but I truly believe human rights needs to remain a top priority in our foreign policy. And the Chinese Communist Party's repression, both at home and abroad, demands our action, our attention, and we need to be steadfast in that area as well. So as we look ahead, we already recognize there are several significant opportunities for the U.S. to strengthen its influence in the region and to secure a future that reflects our values and our interest. So I look forward to working closely together with not only with my colleagues here, but with folks like you who are working on the ground and you are experts in the field. So we want to stay engaged in our conversation, and we want to work with you as resource to many of us. So let's work together to ensure that our policies align with our with the challenges and opportunities that East Asia and the Pacific region faces. With that, I want to thank you again for joining us. The committee stands adjourned.